Dopamine is the molecule of motivation and pursuit, and it can be triggered by a number of different things. However, it is a non-infinite, yet renewable resource. So if you have two big dopamine releases, let's say from methamphetamine or cocaine, damn, we're going there. The people being in a lot of gunfights in a short period of time. The period immediately after that will involve a mirror symmetric decrease in dopamine. You don't go back down to baseline, you go below the baseline. So we all should guard our dopamine peaks very carefully. A little bit goes a long way, a lot goes even further, but it also takes you deeper afterward. This is the basis of addiction, and this is the beautiful work of Alec and Rob Lenka at Stanford and elsewhere showing that, when it goes down, do we want it back right now? So the dip afterward is actually associated with a molecule called dynorphin, which is the opposite of endorphin and involves pain in the body. So for every bit of pleasure that we get from pursuing and getting the thing that we were pursuing, the crash that comes afterward feels painful. And all that we need to do in order to return to a baseline of dopamine to renew that resource is to wait and make sure that we don't try and trigger yet more dopamine in that time. So you asked about whether should I be taking caffeine. In addition to training and blasting music, I always say people differ on this spectrum, but be careful about stacking dopamine. The training itself is a stimulus for dopamine release. Cold water is a stimulus for dopamine release. But if you start doing training in cold water, listening to your favorite music, plus you're taking, let's say some stimulant doesn't. Obviously the stimulants we've been talking about are terrible. But some of the stronger stimulants out there, actually you can tell if somebody has a lot of dopamine and adrenaline in their system just by looking at them. Their pupils are big. So somewhat paradoxically, when pupils are big, your visual aperture is narrow. That just has to do with the so-called accommodation of the eye, the optics of the eye. So remember, big pupils means somebody is high on their own. Dopamine and adrenaline could be drug-induced, could be situational, etc. Small pupils are going to be in a relaxed state. Now, of course, it's also going to be modulated about how bright it is in the environment. Yeah, because of the way these systems work. But when you can see somebody wide-eyed, well, dopamine and adrenaline also do something else. They actually trigger activation of the brainstem cranial nuclei that cause the opening of the eyelid. They also cause eyes effect. When we get sleepy, what happens? Our eyes go down when we're awake. Eyelids are open and eyes are up. They might not be up like this. These relate to 3 different cranial nerve nuclei for future med students. You'll learn what these are. So it all makes perfect sense because nature is beautiful and biology is laid out for us. But if we start stacking behaviors plus pharmacology, plus, mindsets that increase dopamine, great. But what that means is that if you get a really big dopamine increase, well then that afternoon you might not feel the drive to do the work here, especially in Silicon Valley. But dopamine fasting, the people, I don't even want to look at somebody else's face. I'm not gonna eat, tasty food. I'm not gonna do anything that stimulates dopamine. Sure, that will reset what you find pleasurable. But let's be realistic. The better way to do things would be to modulate dopamine release, control it, and make it work for you. And everyone's going to differ. So for some people, it's gotta be music, the pre-workout, 4 cups of espresso and someone screaming in their face that they have to do it well. For other people who require fewer of those variables. But everyone needs to learn how they feel, both before, during, and after a behavior. I think the right amount of exercise is what you can do consistently and train hard, but that also allows you to perform unless you're an athlete, and that's your profession, to be able to do the other things throughout the day that are beneficial to you. And of course, some people are training late in the day, and I have no problem with that. I got kind of attacked by the fitness centers recently, or whatever you call them online, cause I said, training early in the day. Such this dopamine pulse like training late in the day has been shown in these 19 studies. Sure, I'm sure. When your body temperature is elevated later in the day, lubrication of the joints and mental acuity, sure. But for most people who just need to get more movement and are trying to maximize focus on productivity throughout the day, early day training is going to be probably the better option. But sometimes is better than no time. But if you're training late in the day and you're getting a big increase in body temperature, and you're doing it under bright lights and you're drinking a pre-workout and you're wondering why you can't sleep at night, it's, you don't have to be Sigmund Freud or a neuro to understand that you basically just have your body. You're cranking your body temperature up. Hence a lot of these technologies. And here, this isn't a promotion. We don't, at least not now, don't have a relationship with any of them. I won't even name them. There are a lot of technologies now about making your bed cool. This mad or that this, to cool down your body temperature at night so you can sleep. So if you start thinking about this in kind of a rational structure, it makes sense. It also makes sense why. For instance, after a big win, sometimes we feel a crash and we need some time to reset. And that lower depression, sometimes people make the mistake of going out and pursuing more dopamine. One of the areas that I have a real concern about is just because I hear about it so often, and it wasn't an issue when I was growing up, is a lot of young guys, in particular, approach me because they're based on the questions I'm getting. They're watching a lot of really intense pornography. And we know there's studies now going on at Stanford and elsewhere. Pornography creates a strong dopamine rush. These are very primitive pathways that in some ways can overwhelm the dopamine system. And then, another thing is happening. There's a lot of young guys are getting all this arousal from watching other people have sex, and then they're in the real world scenario. Wait, you're no longer a third person in this. You're actually in this scene, and it's completely collapsing them. And so I'm not one of these anti-porn people. I'm not here to judge. I'm just a scientist. I'm reporting that. I always say I'm not a doctor. I don't prescribe things. I'm a professor, so I profess things. You can decide what you want to do with it or not. But once you understand dopamine, that all makes perfect sense. They're getting this enormous dopamine released from something that is external to them in real life. May not mimic the intensity of the combination of variables. There's an initial issue with pornography, which is not often discussed, which is that, remember guys, in particular, the brain is a learning prediction machine. And I'm not trying to say that all pornography is bad, but there is. Good data supports the idea that if your brain learns to be aroused by watching other people have sex, it is not necessarily going to carry over to the ability to get aroused when you're one-on-one with somebody else. But the idea here is that I'm not saying pornography as a stimulus is bad or good. What I'm saying is that in its availability and its extreme forms, it's a very potent stimulus and very potent stimuli of any kind. Extremely palatable food, extreme pornography, extreme experiences like bungee cord jumping. Those set the threshold for dopamine release. And Anna will tell you that, and I'm sure she did. The higher the dopamine peak, the bigger the drop afterward. And it's not that you drop to baseline, you drop below baseline.